Hey guys, so we're going to move into what's called the Constitutional Convention. And so if you remember at the very end of Unit 2, we talked about how the articles were failing, how they were coming back to the table, that type of thing. And so I'm going to explain this to you guys through video notes. I'm going to try to flip back and forth and do a couple drawing things on here so that you have a better understanding. But the biggest thing with video notes, guys, is whether you're doing it with me or with anybody else, college classes, whatever, start and stop as you go. You know, I'm going to talk through slides, but if you are falling behind and I'm trying to move ahead to the next slide, go ahead and pause the video, get what you need down so that you can then in turn sit and listen to what I'm explaining, that type of thing. And so we're going to start with the Constitutional Convention. And right here, you do not write this. This is simply a review from the last unit, kind of where we ended before. So if you see there's the picture of Shays' Rebellion that I had before. And really, there was this call for a stronger national government. The articles, if you remember, were intentionally weak. And those weaknesses led to Shays' Rebellion, and the fact that they couldn't put down Shays' Rebellion became a problem. And there was also, things like national debts from the war that they took on because now we're this new country. And the articles of, who's going to pay for those debts? Well, if it's the new nation, but you only give up taxes voluntarily, that was becoming an issue, and people were wanting their money. And so James Madison ends up taking the lead. And so first he calls for the Annapolis Convention, 1786. But if you remember, if you look up there's Shays' Rebellion, also 1786. Shays' Rebellion hadn't really hit its peak, and so not many people attended this because they're like, no, it's fine, we don't need to deal with this. Well, Shays' Rebellion was that bubble. It's the thing that popped it. And so after Shays' Rebellion and the struggles that the federal Congress had with trying to put down the rebellion, people started realizing, hey, we should probably come to the table. So they meet in Philadelphia, later to be called the Constitutional Convention. But remember, the original goal was to amend the articles, just like we talked about, was not to change it. But then they quickly realized we're going to have to scrap this. So there's no way to take what we made before and put it into something new. So we're going to scrap it. We're going to start all over again, which that was a bold move on their part. And so this is where the Constitutional Convention begins. Okay, you have in Philadelphia in 1787, 55 delegates. They met at the State House in Pennsylvania. And really, like I said, the purpose was to strengthen the enforcement powers of the national government. That was the goal. We have to be able to build a government that can enforce the laws, that can enforce taxes in order to pay for a military that will protect our country and things like that. So there was a number of issues on the table at this convention, and very quickly some problems started to arise. And so you had people that were starting to bring their plans when it became apparent that they were going to have to redo and really scrap the articles. States kind of saw dollar signs in their head. They saw opportunity in their heads. And so you started having states really push their plans forward. And so the first plan is the Virginia Plan. It's also known as the Large State Plan. Now, in your pretest, your benchmark zero test, many of you got this question mixed up. You mixed up New Jersey and Virginia because on the map it looked like that there was more people in New Jersey, but in fact Virginia had a much higher population. And so in this plan, Virginia comes in and says, okay, articles are gone. Let's start building this new constitution. Virginia, we have a plan. And so what it did is it called for to have three branches, so just like Montesquieu, three branches. You had a legislative branch. It was bicameral, ding, ding, ding. There is a vocab word for you, bicameral, which means two chambers in that Congress, where they said there was a lower house called the House of Representatives. You had the upper house, which was the Senate. All were based upon population. The executive branch was the law enforcing branch. This was new. This was not there in the article, so this is a brand new branch. the law enforcing branch of government. And what would happen is that the president, the person who was in charge of this branch, was going to be chosen by the legislature. Okay? This is a little different than how it ended up being, obviously, because we vote for president, things like that. But in this, what Virginia was saying is that you have two chambers in Congress, all based upon population. And then what would happen is those chambers, both chambers, would then vote and decide on the person to become president of the law enforcing branch. Now the thing you have to think about, guys, why would Virginia want it this way? Well, at that time, they were the most populous state out of all of them. So this meant that they would have more people in the House of Representatives. They would have more people in the Senate. And if they had more people in both of those, the likelihood that their person would be president was a lot higher. That is one of the reasons why the Virginia plan was super important to them. Then they also had a judicial branch, the law interpreting branch of government. Now, in it, they had very vague expectations, but again, appointed by the legislature, which under New Jersey plan, bicameral, two houses, both based upon population. Yeah, Virginia's going to have the most say once again. So hopefully you all are seeing, yes, they separate the powers under the Virginia plan, but that's all going back to the fact that Virginia was the highest populated state out of the 13 colonies. Now, what's interesting, though, is that obviously is not the case today. You look at the map, the side of my room, you will see the Electoral College and electoral votes. California has the highest. That's because they are the most densely populated, or the most, not densely, but most populated state. Then you look down at Texas, the second most. And so those numbers have changed. What's interesting about if this was actually still around today. So obviously there was a lot of states, kind of the smaller states, that did not like this because they were not going to have a say. Their voice in government was not going to be effective. And so they believed that, okay, we traded tyranny for a weak government. Now we're going back to tyranny? That's not fair. And so then you start to have kind of these issues arise. And so you had key questions here. Should Congress represent people or states? And so in Virginia plan, kind of like we talked about, there was advantages. It favors larger states. It received more votes than smaller, less populous states. And their argument is, if we have more people in our state, we should have more representation throughout, because that means that if there's all based on representation, our people are going to have a higher voice. Now, opposition, it was unfair to smaller states, unequal representation across the states. So then you have New Jersey. They're a smaller state, so again, kind of flip-flop what your mindset was on your guys' benchmark zero exam. The New Jersey plan was the small state plan because it was a smaller populated state. Now, what's interesting about New Jersey is that they're like, you know what, we kind of like what's in the Articles of Confederation. They wanted to revise the Articles but strengthen that national government. So a lot of the characteristics they felt were going to be the same, such as the legislative branch. They believed that in the legislative branch, unicameral, that vocab term we talked about in the last unit, had equal representation across the board, and that there was only one vote per state. One vote per state. And so they didn't really talk a whole lot about a executive branch, but the judicial branch they did add. They felt like there would need to be a branch that was tasked with making sure that states could resolve their issues as they go. And that was going to be chosen by the executive branch, and then they would serve for life. That is something we have pulled into our Constitution, which we'll get to when we get to that point. And so all you need on here is the part that's the little chart that's in the yellow, okay? That's all you need to have written down. But you have some plans for nuclear. You have some key questions. Should national laws be supreme over state laws? Okay, what was a major flaw here? Really, to give or not give power to the national government. These were all questions that were formulating as they were also arguing big state, small states. Then you have two factions develop. And a lot of historians argue that these are the first two political parties. You have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, political parties we haven't really talked about yet, but essentially a political party is a group of people with strong beliefs that are very similar, okay? Boom, right here, Federalists. They believe that the national laws should have supremacy. National government needs to be greater than state government. They said their argument was that this was better for making sure that we can protect our country, to make sure that if you go back to Unit 1, that we're maintaining order, all of those things. It's easier to do that. Then you have the other side, the Anti-Federalists, that said no, the national government should be equal to states. They should be operating as co-equals without challenging the states. And so we see a little bit of both of these today, but these are really the first two political parties that we see. So it's going to work. I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but I'm going to go ahead and play this for you guys as part of the video, but it's also linked in Canvas as well.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics. And today we're going to talk about the single most important document in America, one that we'll be talking about a lot over the next few months. No, I'm not talking about O Magazine. It's the United States Constitution, and what we're really going to focus on is how it got made and how it became the foundation of our government. Those of you who watched the U.S. History series with John Green probably remember that the government set up by the Constitution is actually the second attempt at an American government. Also, as pointed out in the comments, you probably noticed that I am not John Green. The first American government, which was in place during the Revolutionary War and for almost 10 years afterwards, was the Articles of Confederation. Like many first attempts, the Articles government had some good ideas and it meant well, but it was poorly executed. Just give it a break. It never did this before. So when delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles, they ended up scrapping the whole thing and creating a new constitution. It's probably not because they didn't know what revise meant. So the delegates from the various states each had their own agendas at the Constitutional Convention, and that made it difficult for them to agree on what the new government should look like. In order to hammer out a constitution, they had to do something you don't see very much in government these days. Compromise. Oh, let's compromise. I'm sorry, Eagle, I didn't mean. Before we get into what those compromises were, it's kind of necessary to look at what was so bad about the Articles government in the first place. The main thing was it really couldn't govern. There was no executive branch or president and no judiciary to settle disputes. It was basically just a Congress where each state was equally represented and they all pretty much had veto power and could sink legislation they didn't like. All decisions were collected, which meant that very few decisions were actually made, because it's really hard to get 13 people to agree on something that will be in the interest of all 13. I can barely agree with Stan on anything, right, Stan? He said wrong. Most important, the Articles government had no power to levy taxes, which meant that if it needed any money to do, well, anything, it had to ask for the money from the states, which were free to say, no, I don't think we'll be giving you any money today, or tomorrow, wherever. As I remember from my college years, and I don't remember much, living without money is awful. Without money, it's pretty much impossible for a government to do anything, except buy ramen noodles. The Articles government was able to accomplish one notable thing, though. One of the big issues it had to deal with was Americans moving out west, which in the 1770s and 80s meant to places like Ohio and Indiana that weren't states yet. The government managed to set up rules for these settlements in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This set up a system for eventual statehood, but most importantly, it forbade slavery in these territories, which, as students of American history know, was kind of a big deal. You wouldn't know that. You're not a student of American history. You're a symbol of America, bird. I'm not going to punch you. Other than that, though, the Articles government was a flop. And the very thing that made it so ineffective threatened to screw up any attempts at new government, too. This was the issue of competing interests between different states. More specifically, the states with large populations and the smaller states. Basically, a state with a large population, like, say, Virginia, had different needs than a state with a small population, like Delaware. More importantly, large states might stand to benefit more from any government spending. When the delegates decided to make a new Congress, these large population states wanted the number of representatives to that Congress to be proportional to the states' populations, which would mean that the larger states would have more representatives than the smaller ones. This idea, a large Congress made up of many delegates, was called the Virginia Plan because it was put forward by the delegates from Wisconsin. Just kidding, Virginia. The delegates from small New Jersey put forward a plan that would have a Congress where each state would send an equal number of representatives. In other words, something that looked a lot like the Articles government. This New Jersey plan would prevent smaller states from being dominated by the larger states, and also ensure that the large states wouldn't be able to vote themselves a bigger share of government spending. These two opposing interests threatened to scuttle the whole new government thing until Roger Sherman from Connecticut proposed the Great Compromise that gave us the bicameral legislature that we talked about in episode 2, and we've all come to know and love. Sometimes. So the Great Compromise meant that we would have a two-house legislature, but this wasn't the only issue related to how the seats in Congress would be apportioned. The membership in the House would be based on the state's population, but at the time there was an issue about how to count that population. The issue was slavery, more specifically, how to count slaves as part of the state's population. Let's go to the thought bubble. The states with large slave populations like South Carolina and Virginia had a pretty big interest in counting these slaves for the purposes of determining representation. And the states with few slaves didn't want them counted at all, because this would mean that the white non-slave people in those states with lots of slaves would effectively be better represented than the white non-slave people in the states with few slaves. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention solved this problem with another compromise that was decidedly less great. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution includes the following clause. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. If you're looking for the word slave, you won't find it. They're the ones described by the phrase 3/5 of all other persons. This is the notorious 3/5 compromise. What it means is that in order to determine how many representatives a state has, you count the number of free people in the state, including indentured servants, and add to that number 3/5 of the number of non-free persons, otherwise known as slaves. So in terms of counting, each slave was worth 3/5 of each free person. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Anyway, this meant that the states with large populations of slaves would be disproportionately represented in Congress, but not quite so badly that most northern states with small numbers of slaves wouldn't vote for the Constitution. What this also did was enshrine the idea that slaves, who were mostly black, were worth less than free people, who were mostly white, and it embedded slavery into the Constitution. So before this Constitution of Compromise could go into effect, it had to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states. So each state had a special convention where delegates could vote on whether or not to adopt the new Constitution. These conventions were more open to the public than the Constitutional Convention itself, and the ratification process is the reason why some people say the Constitution is based on the will of the people. But not everybody wanted the Constitution, and they needed convincing. This is where things get a little confusing. Did you want the Constitution? Did you? In 1787, public opinion about the Constitution was pretty evenly divided. Those who wanted the Constitution were called Federalists, largely because of the Federalist Papers, a series of articles written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They wrote the Federalist Papers to convince voters in New York to ratify the Constitution, and since New York did eventually ratify the document, I guess they worked. But we should listen to both sides of the argument in the Clone Zone. So joining us in the Clone Zone today will be Federalist Clone and Anti-Federalist Clone. Let's hear from Federalist Clone first. Fetty? Can I call you Fetty?
No. The Federalists were the incredibly intelligent Americans who thought that a strong central government would benefit the country as a whole. They tended to come from cities, and often they represented commercial classes, especially wealthy people who had lent money to the government during the Revolution. They liked the new Constitution because they felt that a strong national government would pay its debts, and this was good for business. They also tended to want stronger ties with England, again, because England was a good trading partner. Given the raging success of the Articles government, it's pretty clear that the Federalists were right.
Okay, now let's hear from Anti-Federalist Clone. How do you respond, Auntie? I'm not your aunt. Sure, Federalists were right to believe in tyranny. Anti-Federalists were right to be skeptical of a large government that would trample on our individual liberties. They didn't want a big government that would tax them to death and possibly take away their slaves. In general, Anti-Federalists felt that states would be the best protectors of people's rights and liberties because, being smaller, they would be more responsive to people's needs. Okay, the Anti-Federalists published pamphlets and articles too, but we weren't quite as organized, so we didn't have a coherent set of Anti-Federalist papers to push on government students. Okay, you seem really mad about this.
I am.
But you eventually lost the debate.
I did.
Huzzah!
How come he got to shoot fireworks?
I didn't know he was going to
shoot
okay?
fireworks.
I'm sorry. Next time, you can have fireworks.
So the Federalist position won out, and the Constitution was ratified, and that's the government that Americans have been living under ever since. Hooray! Because the Constitution was passed, we tend to think that everyone loved it, but it wasn't nearly as clear-cut as hindsight makes it appear. Eventually, the Federalists had to offer another compromise, promising a Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments. This isn't called one of the constitutional compromises because it happened outside of the convention, but it was yet another example of how different interests had to give a little in order to get a constitution passed. It's very important to remember that compromise, the idea of balancing interests and giving a little to get a lot, is embedded in the Constitution. While today it seems like a political dirty word, compromise is the basis of the American government itself. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Well, I'll compromise. See you in a week and a half. Let's face it, Stan's probably not going to get this done in time anyway. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital.
All right, guys, so in that crash course, I always like showing that one about the compromises because he does a little bit of recap, some things we talked about, which is always good to hear again. But then he also jumps into some of the important aspects that come out of the tension there. You know, it doesn't sound like a lot, guys, but the that issue that they had between, you know, Virginia versus New Jersey, like the big states versus small, that nearly derailed the entire convention. Like the entire Constitutional Convention almost stopped because of this right here, the Virginia versus New Jersey. That was the problem. The big state or small states. That was the major issue that was coming out of this. It, like I said, it nearly derailed and stopped the whole thing in its tracks. But as you heard in the film or in the video, you have Roger Sherman come in and he provides a compromise. Now again, like he talks about, compromise is often looked at as a dirty word. And it can be at certain times if you give up certain like deep-seated values that you have. But in a lot of cases, especially with the Constitution, you see an important kind of getting through that moment. That moment they were struggling, and compromise saved the day. And so you have, for the first compromise, you have the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. And it first talks, the first thing that they get over is representation. Okay, so remember, Virginia, you were going to have everything based upon population because they had a lot of people. That was going to benefit them. They were going to have more power. New Jersey, they wanted to kind of keep aspects of the Articles of Confederation, one vote per state. And so what they decided on is that you have a lower house called the House of Representatives. And then you have an upper house called the Senate. And those, they decided to kind of split the two things, the two ideas between them. And so let's go back here, okay? Find my little eraser. Bear with me, guys. I'm doing this the best I can. I'm not used to having all this technology at my disposal, so. So what you have right now in our Congress, we have a bicameral legislature. So we have the House and we have the Senate. The House is based upon population. So places like California, Texas, New York, Florida, they all have a ton of representation there, okay, because it's based upon population. Whereas the Senate, you have basically, it's equal. So you have 2 per state, okay? And so the minimum number of senators that you're going to have is always going to be 2. The minimum number of House members you're going to have as a state is actually 1. And so I believe it is actually Wyoming. Wyoming's interesting because they have 1 rep for the entire state. The entire state of Wyoming has 1 rep. But because in the Senate there are 2, you get 2 per state, they have 2 senators. Okay? So to give you guys a little bit of understanding what Missouri is like. So up here I'm going to go Missouri. Okay? Sorry for the mess up here. So in Missouri, we have 8 reps and 2 senators based upon this plan, the Connecticut Compromise. So let's go back here. And so the result, no legislation would pass without the approval of people. So legislation, especially money, anything that's tax dollars funding the government, anything to do with money starts in the House of Representatives. So the place where the most representation takes place across this country, that is where all the money bills start. And so this compromise ends up saving the day. Okay? And so this is a great chart kind of giving you guys what did Virginia plan provide, what did New Jersey plan provide, and then what came out of it. Now, this is one of the more difficult moments when talking about the compromise that led to the Constitution, and that's the 3/5 compromise, because you had a large, during this time, 1789, I kind of alluded to it before, you had a large slave population. And so they weren't considered people. They were property. They were being bought. And so what you had is the large slave populated states, particularly in the South. They wanted slaves counted despite being considered property. The North was against this. They said, no, this is hypocrisy. You do not treat them as people. You treat them as property. Therefore, you should not count them. You're just doing this as a way to have more say. And so the result of the compromise is that 3/5 of the slaves would be counted. There's a chart over there. But the flip side is that the slave trade would be banned after 20 years. Now, we've talked about this before, how the wheels of change in society are very slow. Okay? So when you're looking at this doesn't sound like a lot. Doesn't sound like a lot. It's frustrating. 3/5 of slaves are going to be counted. But on the flip side, the slave trade is banned after 20 years. That doesn't sound like a big step, but it actually is. Getting the actual slave trade banned after 20 years was a massive step in the direction where many abolitionists were wanting to go in this country. And then not only that, also in there, no slavery was going to be allowed in new states, according to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And the Native Americans were completely excluded out of this. And so what happens here is, again, it's frustrating, slow progress, but it is a little bit of progress. But for a lot of people, this compromise embeds slavery in the Constitution. And so that is a very difficult thing that's going to take really the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, which we'll get to make those changes. And so ratifying the Constitution was a whole other process. They get it down, they get it done, cross the T's and dot the I's. Now it's time to try to get the states on board with it. And so they had a process with that as well. And so the original Constitution, there was actually only what's called 7 articles. In those 7 articles, it creates this new government. Article 1's the legislative branch and everything that goes with it. Article 2 is the executive branch, everything goes with it. Article 3 is the judicial branch. So it sets up this government. And so there were 13 states at the time. 13 states were around, okay? They needed 9 of the 13 states for the Constitution to officially become law of the land. And so what happened is, once the Constitution was finalized, copies of it was sent back to all 13 states' legislatures. And they would then have to debate and vote and go through the whole process of whether they wanted the Constitution. And for some states it was very quick. For a lot of states it was very slow. But eventually all 13 states did ratify the Constitution. But on the ninth state, that was the one where at that moment, as soon as the vote was cast and it was passed, that is when the Constitution became law of the land. And so on June 21st, about 1788, New Hampshire was that 9th state, and that is whenever the Constitution was officially put into place. And so right here you have the preamble. It's the introduction. It lets people know exactly what this document's going to be about. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. It's a key word there. To ensure domestic tranquility. Okay, domestic means at home. Tranquil means peaceful. Provide for the common defense. Everybody's going to get defended. Promote the general welfare, meaning everybody has a chance to life, liberty, property. John Locke. Secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So blessings of freedom to ourselves as well as our generations to come from us, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America, one of the most famous introductions, if not the most famous introduction ever. So then again, you come back to these opposing sides. The Federalists were for the Constitution with zero changes. They liked it, they didn't need it. Anti-Federalists, who, as you saw from the film, were largely unsuccessful, okay? Really, with about everything they did, they were unsuccessful. And so they were against the Constitution as is. They argued for a Bill of Rights. And so if there's, for the amount of unsuccessful things that the anti-federalists were trying to push, the one thing that they accomplished, and that is probably one of the most important things in the Constitution, is that they were able to get the Bill of Rights. That was usually the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And so here's the debate. The Federalists said the Bill of Rights were not necessary. The Constitution protected citizens against tyranny. States had their own Bill of Rights, and therefore that they were able to keep people free. However, the Anti-Federalists believed that the Constitution was too vague. Their counter-argument is that the supreme national government would overrule the states like they established, and so therefore tyranny could happen at any time. And so in 1791, a Bill of Rights was added to the United States Constitution. It was the first 2 amendments. So, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, press, religion, all those things. Amendment 2, the right to bear arms. And what's interesting is I go back to the previous slide. James Madison was a Federalist. He was somebody who wanted the Constitution as is. But he knew he wasn't going to get it passed. And so he, on a gentleman's handshake, that was it. There was no contract. It's a gentleman's handshake, said, I will add a Bill of Rights. And so in this new government, and then the government's established in the Constitution, he becomes a member of the House of Representatives. And the first thing he does is he writes the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Again, he could have easily said, I'll do it, and then lied. Because I feel like you would probably see that fairly often in our modern time. He didn't. Gentleman's handshake, said, I will give you a Bill of Rights if you pass this. They said yes. And then the first thing he did when he became a congressman is that he wrote the Bill of Rights. And we'll hit those pretty heavy as we move throughout this unit. All right, and so guys, kind of a recap here. This was the Constitutional Convention, the issues that arose, okay? You had the compromise, or you had the two sides, the large states versus small states. You had the compromise there. You had the Connecticut Compromise. Then you went to the 3/5 compromise, which again kind of good and bad. And then eventually the allowing for the Bill of Rights to take place was the third major compromise. And through those compromises, we were able to get our Constitution. Okay, we haven't unpacked the Constitution. We haven't talked about the articles. We haven't jumped into the Bill of Rights. We haven't jumped into all the amendments yet. But just having that around establishes or has established the longest running democracy the world's ever seen. So guys, hopefully this made sense. If you have any questions, please reach out. I'm happy to answer them as we go throughout this entire unit. If you need anything at all, just shoot me an email.